Science, History of Science, and the Muse of Discovery. Where does the Muse come from? Now, when we talk about science, you have to define it first. It's a way of acquiring knowledge about objects and processes, both external and internal, to reasoning beings, that functions by generating testable hypotheses concerning the objects or processes of interest and then testing them by observation statements. Now, you may know that this definition of science was first formally proposed by Sir Karl Raimund Popper in 1933 and elaborated in 1934, and has since been widely recognized by many scientists as the best definition of science. This is the original version of his book, Logik der Forschung, which has been translated into English in 1959 as The Logic of Scientific Discovery. Popper, in here, propounded this definition of science, and he emphasized that it doesn't matter how you conceive hypotheses, but it matters they be testable, and that they be testable by observation statements. That is the most important thing. So in his first popular collection of essays, Albert Einstein was an acquaintance of Popper's, and he very much liked Popper's definition. Einstein pointed out that to pursue science, we need two things. You need certain general conditions that are called principles, and from these principles you make deductions, and these deductions are tested. So our task is divided into two. First, to find the principles, and two, to test those principles. Einstein pointed out that at schools and universities, we learn the business of testing very well. We learn how to observe things, we learn how to make experiments, blah, 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 blah. It's excellent. But to find the principles, Einstein pointed out, there is absolutely no method that is teachable. That means that in order to conceive hypotheses or even to recognize problems, unfortunately, we can't teach you about that. And you're entirely dependent on your brains and other circumstances that can't be any further defined. So, where do we find the Muse of Discovery? Now, there are various possibilities. You can do it in the field. Geologists often are found in this attire, David Rowley in particular. He's been unbelievably well dressed for the few last days because of my presence here. In solitary contemplation, you can find it with our peers. Notice the peers. There is, I think, a naval captain talking to Einstein. In libraries, that's my preferred place to sit in. You can go on expeditions. This is in Caltech. This is the farthest Albert went on an expedition. And you can be frivolous. David and I studied in an institution where being frivolous helped in generating hypotheses. So, another way of asking the same question is, what is the origin of hypotheses? And remember, this was the thing that Einstein said, don't know. Now, Grove Carl Gilbert, many people said that James Dwight Dana was probably the greatest geologist that the United States produced. I disagree. It was Grove Carl Gilbert. I mean, I would ask the entire audience here to gently rise and stand 1 minute in silence in his presence. This was an amazing man, really an amazing man. And Gilbert was president of the Washington Geological Society, and then he was, when he was asked to give his presidential address, he chose the title, The Origin of Hypotheses. And Gilbert said, the way we generate hypotheses is to use analogies. Now, I underline, he didn't say homologies. He didn't necessarily say that we use things that have similar functions. Simply similar things, simply things that trigger things in our minds. And he used the meteorite impact crater in Arizona as an example, and he came to the wrong conclusion. But never mind. So in my experience, history of geology helped me find cases analogous to those under my consideration at any given time, or to find hints to that suggested analogies. So by studying the solutions, you're led to hypotheses. I said discovery here. This is extremely arrogant and preposterous, but this was chosen for a very exalted occasion. So it really means that they led me to lies that I can fool my colleagues for sometimes, and in the process, advance the science. So you cannot do the same always by consulting the present literature, because the present literature is conceived, written in the same framework in which you're working. But you want to step outside that framework to be able to generate really dashing hypotheses. So I will give you two examples. I wrote a paper in 1976, and this is the memorable date that David told you about. It's collision of irregular continental margins, implications for foreland deformation of alpine-type orogens. And then when I became a student at Albany, this is 2 years after I became a student, an enlarged version was written by Kevin Burke and John Dewey and myself. This simply said that when you have continental collision, one continent banging into another one, it cracks the other continent and creates a rift valley. Now, I was led to that problem through two things. I went to a meeting in Germany in 1975 with the structural geology professor Carl Norman in Houston. He was sent along with me that he might get some enthusiasm out of this business. Literally, I mean, that's what John Butler said, take Carl with you. He said, we want him to get more active, he said. And I said, I'll do it with great pleasure. And in that meeting, the Rheingraben was presented as a result of mantle updoming. You know, you dome the continent like a tart or whatever, you know, as a cake, and the top fractures. But the Rheingraben is rather too regular for that, because north-south. And the late Professor Ilias presented it. I didn't like it. And I remembered that I had read this paper, Zum Problem der Grabenbildung by Maximilian Weber. Maximilian Weber pointed out in a series of papers in 1921 that rifts form at high angles to mountain belts and are similar in origin to the AC joints of faults. An AC joint is very simple. If you make a fold like that, you make cracks in here because something that you shorten in that direction get extended in this direction. Simple. And that's what Max Weber thought. And great authorities like Hans Cloos said this was nonsense. Didn't like it. Cloos thought that rifts form by uplift. But look at the figure Cloos drew in his own textbook. See, I remembered that figure because this is a 1936 book. Now, when I was a little student, I only had a reprint of it done in 1964. This was a very influential textbook. It survived the plate tectonics revolution. In the 70s, it was being used. And justifiably so. It was a very good textbook. But look what Cloos did. Here's a mountain belt. 90 degrees to it is a rift. Now, if he thought Weber was full of it, why did he do it that way? So, observationally, Cloos knew somehow, even perhaps before Weber said it, that rifts form at 90 degrees to the mountain belts. And little Jalal, in 1976, I said, look at this. Now, funny it is, because today, the Rheingraben, and this is the Pfalzlinie, and this is the Elbe-Linie, and this is the lower Rheingraben, these things today sit with respect to the Alpine belt in a shear orientation. However, if the initial collision was here with the Briançonnet continent, I thought that a collision like that could create a crack, just like this. And we know from around the Rheingraben there are dikes that have come in, just a little bit older than Rheingraben, that extended it. But, I mean, never mind the story. The inspiration was Weber's papers. Had I not read them, I don't know whether I would have been able to come up with the solution. And this became very popular, and Kevin Burke invented the word impactogen for these things. It was having read Weber, the memory of Weber's paper in my mind, triggered it. And I said, fine. Well, I mean, this is a fairly innocent example. Now, there's a more profound example. When I got interested in Central Asia, see, Central Asia is an amazing place. It is full of mountain belts, full of old mountain belts, and nobody had been able to draw boundaries between them. It is a mountain belt that looks not so much like an elegant lady. Most mountain belts are thin and long, like elegant ladies. You know, they look like Janet. Whereas this mountain belt in Central Asia looked like me. It was round, and it looked nothing like a mountain belt. So it had been a problem, and the poor Russians had come up with most incredible hypotheses about them. And one of them was called, what was that called, David? The mosaic model of geosynclines. That was totally rubbish. You know, they were naming things that you don't understand. So when I got interested in this, and these are the papers that resulted, initial papers that resulted from that interest, and I got interested in that, I said, okay, I will look at the old literature. What the area we're talking about is, now this is the Caspian Sea. There's the Arctic Ocean. This is the Scandinavian Peninsula. And here's Japan, Kamchatka. And Lake Baikal is here. This is Lake Balkhash, and Aral Sea used to be here, but it's gone now. This is the Altaids, these Central Asian mountain ranges. And as you can see, I mean, a normal mountain range looks like that, or looks like this, the Alps and Himalayas. They don't look like this. So you said, why does it look like that? It's very, very strange. And when I started reading the literature, I said, okay, I'll look at the older literature first. Baron Alexander von Humboldt, in 1829, paid a visit to there because of the invitation of Baron Cancrin, who was the Minister of Finance. Now, you might be curious about knowing why a Minister of Finance is interested in having geological expeditions. You know, happy were those days. But Baron Cancrin was trying to get Humboldt to tell him whether platinum could be used as a basis for Russian money. So they invited Humboldt. Humboldt said he would like to see these Central Asian mountains. But look at what he says. He says his account of the Russian Altai. Humboldt repeatedly emphasizes the extreme paucity of gneisses. Gneisses are these very highly metamorphic rocks, very coarse-grained. They form from deforming things like granite or really cooking sediments at very high temperatures. And, you know, they are good continental basement. Humboldt said, we don't see enough of them. Now, in those days, gneisses made the axes of mountain ranges. And all mountain ranges had very nice axes of gneisses. And Humboldt was shocked that in Central Asia they didn't exist. He only saw slates, but also various kinds of schists. And he said, well, there is also granite among these schists and slates, but no gneisses. And this is his map. I mean, this map really doesn't say anything, except to say that he says, we see these mountains getting younger southwards. That's what he said. But then comes this very great man. Now, Edward Suess was an amazing man. I mean, this man was the greatest geologist that ever lived. Every time I get elected to some place or I get an award, I look at the previous recipients. He is invariably there. He was an amazing guy. Okay, this is a quote from his famous book, The Face of the Earth, Das Antlitz der Erde, where the third volume, first part, describes Asia. Now look what he says. He says, we may first observe that in these great mountains, as well as in the whole western part of the Altai, beyond the Irtish, not a single band of gneiss of any importance is known to exist. Indeed, this rock is seldom met with at all in these mountains, and never, except as a strictly local occurrence, a remarkable contrast to what is found in other lofty folded ranges. On the other hand, we meet with schistose rocks in surprising abundance. Mica schist, chlorite schist, clay slate, the last named with beds of limestone, and towards its summit, Devonian or lower Carboniferous fossils which are found at many localities. These schists, like those in the Salair and Alatau, are pierced by granite, syenite and porphyry, and diorite in dikes and bosses. In the contact zones lie many of the famous ore bodies of the Altai. Now, granite is an igneous rock that comes in at where oceans go under continents or where continents collide. Now, ignore syenite, because in those days syenite was used in a funny way. So essentially it's saying the same thing. Porphyry, you know, these are mainly andesites. These are found, again, today, subduction zones. Now, diorites, these are a little bit deeper versions of andesites. And he points out in the contact zones lie many of the famous ore bodies of the Altai, like Sierra Nevada. Now, when you read that, you realize he says the same thing about Central Asia as did Humboldt. That's the title page of the first volume of Antlitz. And this is his map. And again here, Zeus drew the trend lines of these mountain ranges, and his message was, from here in that direction, from that in that direction, everything got younger. Now, this is a cross-section he drew in 1914. This goes from center of, just north of Lake Baikal, all the way to the four deeps in the Pacific. And you can see he has indicated the Pacific going under the continent. Now, this insight, ladies and gentlemen, had been lost for at least 60 years. And people such as Hans Stille in Germany, Leopold Kober in Austria, Walter Booker in this country had been responsible. And every time I mention their names, William Spencer Francis Kidd, who was a teacher of both David's and mine, he used to say they should have strangled at birth. But look at this. Particularly concentrate on that. And this is what Professor Taira drew in 1992. He drew a lot of vertical structures in here. And look, this is Pacific going under Japan. This is a cross-section across Japan, by the way. This is undergoing Japan. And you would think that this is very similar to that. But now the Japanese have shot seismic sections across this. Deep seismic sections. Again, look at that. Look at that. Zeus was more right than Taira in 1992. Now you would wonder why that is so. Was that a lucky guess? Now we know that it wasn't. I mean, Zeus's method of dealing with the information, processing the literature was unbelievable. He was sitting in Vienna. He hadn't seen any of these places. He was just doing it by literature and by correspondence. The important thing is that he has looked at these areas, he saw these structures, and these are the accretionary wedges in Oregon that David and I had been raised on. I mean, when we were students, you learned about these things. But you also learned this is the only environment in the world where you're going to make a lot of schists and you're going to make a lot of slates. And behind these things will be the granites, etc. And when these things grow forward as a result of the subduction of the ocean, the granites will invade these things. Now, this is, again, from Japan. We look at what what's called subduction accretion complexes contain. They have pillar lavas, they have cherts, they have varicolored shales, and finally, shales and limestones that come on top of that. And when I reread Zeus, I was struck by the fact that there was no regular variation of rock types across the strike in the Altaids in Central Asia. In fact, there was a monotony of the ubiquitous triplet: basalt, chert, turbidite, in vast areas, invaded by this tonalitic, granodioritic, granitic plutons. Plutons, these are intrusions characteristic of what we call subduction zones, where oceans undergo, underthrust continents. And, oh, I did something stupid, sorry. Would you please go away? Oh, thank you. Well, there was a clever suggestion, click anywhere. That's the kind of thing I like. Now, Zeus described these rocks in structures, and he said, sea of more or less denuded folds. He'd never seen them. You're looking at a satellite image, and these are the denuded folds. Look at that. This isn't the Gobi. Look at it. There's a nice fold. Here's a nice fold. He had seen these things in his mind's eye. And when he looked at the Kwenlun, which is outside the mountain range that I'm talking about, this is northern Tibet. But he studied the reports of von Lotzi, who had gone with Count Szechenyi into this area as a part of the Austrian expedition. And all of these ranges are thrust-bounded subduction accretion complexes today. And Zeus said they looked very much like Central Asia. Now, this is a portion of a map that my colleague of mine and myself we've generated, and please look at it. All the colors other than red and other than these buff colors, they are products of what we today call subduction accretion complexes. The red are these granites, when Humboldt said, that are found in the schistose region. And when we looked at this, we said, this is many subduction accretion complexes that have come together. There's no other way to explain this. So we said all the explanations so far put forward was nonsense. They were trying to do something out of this mountain range that it couldn't do. So we said, look, along these lines, some of them still active today, there had to be big faults that would bring portions of them next to one another. And if you add many Janets next to one another, you will generate a belly like mine. You see, it will be enlarged. That's what's happened in Central Asia. The islands and the reefs become less numerous as distance from the peninsula. Now we're in Southeast Asia because we asked ourselves, in this mess of granite, how are we going to find the individual arc systems? Zeus again points the way. He says, the islands and the reefs become less numerous as the distance from the peninsula increases as you go away from the Malay Peninsula, until at last it becomes impossible to discover the trend lines by which they are governed. But this does not always hold true for the volcanoes. Very often we find that as a cordillera becomes concealed beneath the sea, volcanoes increase in number. And it may happen that the cordillera completely disappears while curves of volcanoes remain visible and reveal the plan of the vanished structure. And he repeats again, he says, the farther out the trend lines advance into the ocean, the more distinctly they are indicated by volcanoes. And he provided a figure for us. Now look at this. You see, when you're on land, when you're on Sumatra, islands, or Borneo, no problem, you can follow the structures. But as you go out into the ocean, look, here, out in the Banda Arc, all you have is volcanoes, especially in those days. So he said, I can follow the trend lines of the mountain range by tracing out the volcanoes. Now, what happens when you erode the volcanoes? You go to the roots of the volcanoes, you see these granites. So we said, these arcs, we know they are no wider than 40 kilometers today. And we know that their fronts are very sharp. So we mapped them out on more schematized basement structures in here. And it turned out that every one of these fragments had its own arc on it, as indicated here. Because the figure, the symbol we chose for them was rather idiotic. I apologize for that. You can hardly see them. But there they are. I can trace them out for you. For example, there's one arc. Okay. There's another one. It goes along like that. See? There's another one. But these are arcs that have been mangled, that have been cut, offset, displaced, and reassembled during the approach of two large plates. Okay? And out of this mess, you come to this more manageable mess. But then this mess, because now you know the arcs, you can pull them apart. You can take the arcs apart, and then you realize you have a single arc. Huge arc like that we see along Eastern Asia today. Now, this was fantastic. And when we proposed this model, many of our Russian friends wanted to know how we thought of this model. And I said, read Zeus. They thought I was joking. I said, no. I said, read Edward Zeus. This is pre-plate tectonics, but it's going to lead you to the right place. Now, another thing. This is not my discovery, but this is a remarkable thing. I mean, that's, history of science helps you in a very funny way in here. This animal has just been found. It's been reported in Chinese Science Bulletin 2009 September. There was in Nature a little report about that again, because they found another fossil of this. Now, this is Anchiornis huxleyi. This is a dinosaur about that big. That big. And you can see that it's a tetrapteryx. That means it has 4 wings. It has wings on the arms, it has wings on the feet. And these wings are not imaginations of Shu and company. These are on the slab. You see them fossilized. Now, the interesting thing about that is that in 1927, an extremely unhappy and unfortunate paleontologist called Gerhard Heilmann, this unfortunate man, for some strange reason, had to live in Denmark. Now, you realize the oldest deposits in Denmark barely go beyond Paleocene. That means, they barely cross the boundary 65 million years, and most of it is quaternary. Most of it is about 2 million years old. And Gerhard Heilmann was a man who was interested in deposits that are 140, 150 million years old. None of that in Denmark. Not only that, of course, because these things didn't exist in Denmark, there are no veteran paleontologists in Denmark, and Gerhard Heilmann bitterly complains in the introduction of his book. He says, "I'm so alone here, there is nobody to talk to." Poor man. But he published a book called On the Origin of Birds. In 1927, he said, it's very clear that these animals birds came out of reptiles. And he said, my God, they look like dinosaurs. But he looked at Archaeopteryx and he said, this animal is really too much of a bird to have hopped directly from dinosaurs or from any other reptile. He said, no, there had to be intermediary forms. So he studied the wing structure of Archaeopteryx and he said, what did Archaeopteryx do with these wings? Archaeopteryx had claws on the wings. And Heilmann said, this animal obviously wanted to climb trees, because that's one way you escape from your enemies, and the other way, you can see your prey, and you can glide from tree to tree, and while you're gliding, you can find your food. And if you happen to be on the ground, your wings give you a lot more area to catch succulent insects, and you can put them into your mouth. Yeah. So he said, well, if this was the function of these wings, let us imagine an animal that would be somewhere intermediary. And he called it Proavis, and he was bold enough, fortunately, to sketch his animal. Now, Beebe, in 1915, already suspected that the birds had a tetrapteryx stage. That means a 4-winged stage beforehand. And he drew an animal, but that was not very carefully thought out. Whereas this animal, Heilmann's animal, was built using stepwise evolutionary arguments. And the beautiful thing about that is, that animal is found in the year 2009. A prediction based on Darwinian model. This is as good a prediction any bloody physicist can make. The physicists think they smell differently under the armpits. They don't. We geologists are as good scientists as they are, and biologists. We can make predictions like that. I dare any physicist to make as complicated a prediction. And look at that. This animal jumped out of the rock. It existed. Now, knowing Heilmann's great success in 1927 gives an immense confidence to you in your methods. And I can tell you, when I heard the discovery of Anchiornis huxleyi, I couldn't sleep all night. I was so excited, like a little child who's given a new toy. I kept looking at it, and I remember when the first feathered dinosaur was found. It was 2000, and I had just been elected, remember, you were there, to the National Academy, to Washington. I went there to sign the signed the book, and the Rowleys most kindly were there to sort of clap for me. My wife came, my father came, my son came. I promptly abandoned all of them. I signed the book and I said goodbye. I said, I have to go. They said, where are you going? I said, I have to go to New York, the American Museum of Natural History. Because I said, the feathered dinosaur is there. It's on loan. I have to see it. I sat in front of that fossil 2 hours. And visitors thought I was a man of the museum. So they asked me questions, which I duly answered. But, I mean, I beg you to look at this. How would you not feel that immense confidence that even poor Darwin was lacking until he was dragged screaming and kicking by Wallace's letter? The history of science, Goethe said once, is science itself. See, science cannot be done without also doing its history. And history of science cannot be done without also doing science, because of the simple reason that both go after the problems that interest science. Without the problems of science, there can be neither science nor its history. Science is not an accumulation of facts. History of science is not an accumulation of facts about scientists, or about facts of science about social circumstances that may connect the two. You know, in both philosophy and history of science, it has become very fashionable to talk about the social circumstances that create the environment of the scientists and their thinking, blah, blah, blah. I mean, I would be too arrogant if I said this, but I can't stop myself. I will say it. You know, it's bullshit. I mean, you know, I wrote a paper once just to show this. The melange concept in geology, never mind what it is, it has been independently discovered 5 times. Once in Scotland, once in Turkey by a Turk working in impossible conditions during the war, then by a Chinaman working in California, and we know that there were 2 episodes earlier that nobody talks about by the Swiss in the Alps, all independent of each other. They all came to the same conclusions. And you ask these so-called social scientists, you say, look, this Chinaman, Ken Shu, was raised in breeding Yangtze. His social environment had absolutely nothing to do with our social environment, right? And he thought exactly the same things as did Greenlee, who was a very stout and religious Scotsman, and the same thing as this poor Turkish graduate student whose world was worlds apart from either the Scotsman or the Chinaman. They thought exactly the same things, came exactly to the same conclusions, because they were looking at exactly the same phenomenon. So it is hypotheses that drive you, but what eventually links the hypothesis into what we hope to be the reality, it is the tests with observation. And that's what distinguishes us. Okay? Both history and history of science are about problems that science goes after in historical continuity. Now, this is where I was going to end my lecture. And, in fact, I told David I was going to end it there, but now I got so excited I'm not. So, I would like to present this to you. I said, we the scientists are the only people who try to create images of something that already exists. And therefore, by definition, it is perfect. Right? Everyone else, artists, businessmen, farmers, soldiers, clerks, the clergy, they must find out whether their creations are perfect, because they don't correspond with any reality. It's their creations. But they can never do it, even if they think they achieved everything they initially aimed for they lack an external absolute standard. Now, our absolute standard is the existing world. I mean, it's perfect because our aim is to describe it. You know, whether you can like it or not, it is there, right? So, pursuit of science is therefore the most sublime and satisfying of all human endeavors. And I apologize to the rest of the world, but ultimately it's the only one that counts anyway. Right? I mean, I have many people around me in Turkey, among our politicians, and these beautiful religious nuts. When their head hurts, they swallow an aspirin. Hail Bayer. Right? And IG Farben probably behind that. I don't know the history of aspirin, but it was a German chemist who did it. So what makes our life possible, what will make life in the future possible, bearable, and perhaps even happy, is science only. All the rest is fine. I mean, you know, it's very important to have art, for example, because that fosters creativity. Great. Some people think religion is necessary. I don't. I think it is evil from head to tail. But, you know, they might have it. But the important thing is if you don't have science, you will not have the luxury of having anything else. And that's why looking at the history of science is very important. It reinforces us in this view of the world. And I am very much afraid we're getting away from that view. We are not communicating with the public. And another advantage the history of science has, that non-scientists can read it. They even can get excited about it. And that is why I would recommend history of science to everybody, but particularly to practicing scientists also, as both a source of inspiration and a source of fun. Thank you.